Now, allow me to introduce today's first speaker. Until recently, David Aikman worked at the Bank of England, where he and his team were responsible for developing the bank's macroprudential framework. Now, I have to admit that the concept of macroprudential policy is new to me, but I believe that listening to David Aikman today will give us a good insight in what it is and why it is relevant for the energy transition, and the role that the financial sector in general, and maybe central banks in particular, can play in speeding up the transition. I guess risk assessment is a key word here. As I said, David Aikman used to work for the Bank of England. However, now he has moved on to another highly renowned institution, King's College London. There he is breaking new grounds, building up a whole new research and education centre under the name of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance. I know that although he has had his new position for only 2 short months, climate change will definitely be on Professor Aikman's agenda in the times to come, as it is today, when he will explore the central bank's role in the transition to a carbon neutral economy. David Aikman in London, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in this event. My name is David Aikman. Until a few months ago, I was an economist at the Bank of England, and I'm now a professor at the Business School at King's College London, where I'm running a new research centre focused on central banking issues. I'm not a climate expert, but as a former central banker, I would like to give you my perspective on the role that central banks can play in the transition to a low-carbon economy. I'll start, if I may, by looking at the parallels between climate risk and the current pandemic. There are lots of overlaps here, but I'd like to focus on the idea that these are both foreseeable risks with huge repercussions for our economies and our broader ways of life. Now, each year, the UK government produces a comprehensive risk planning document that sets out the key risks the country faces and what we're doing to mitigate them. The risk of an influenza-style pandemic has been top of this risk register for many years, but we, like many others, failed to plan adequately for it. Parallels with climate change are obvious. In both cases, I think the fundamental issue is that the risks fall outside the planning horizons of many organisations, what Mark Carney has called the tragedy of the horizon. Now, from a finance perspective, the key problem in both cases is that the risk isn't being priced. So we end up inadvertently taking on far too much risk, leading to massive failures of risk management, broadly defined. Now, until very recently, central banks were pretty much silent on the implications of climate risk for their economies and financial systems. But in the last few years, that's really changed. We've seen supervisors at the Bank of England and the ECB now publish their expectations for how financial firms should be managing these risks, including via the use of scenario analysis. We've seen the establishment of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which has allowed central banks to coalesce with regulators to share knowledge and develop scenarios for sizing and understanding the impact of climate risks. We've seen economists at the Dutch National Bank publish a desk-based climate stress test, the first of its kind internationally. Now we have the Bank of England and the Banque de France planning more ambitious stress tests, and I'll come on to say more about that in a second. Very recently, in a very welcome development, the Basel Committee has set up a task force to look at climate risk issues. And this is important because it's both multilateral and has the potential to result in binding requirements at some point. Let me say a few words about the Bank of England's planned stress test, which unfortunately won't now happen until next year because of the COVID crisis. The bank published a discussion paper setting out details of this exercise in November. The purpose of the exercise is threefold. Firstly, to estimate the size of the exposures of the UK's financial system to climate-related risks. Second, to elicit a better understanding of how financial institutions expect to adjust their balance sheets and business models in response to these risks, and to assess what the collective impact of these actions might be. And third, the test is there to provide a vehicle for identifying and addressing gaps in data and risk management capabilities at firms. And let me kind of add in parentheses here, an implicit aim is also to build capacity at central banks and regulators for understanding and modeling these risks, whose importance will grow in future. Now, the Bank of England's proposed test has some novel features relative to kind of the more plain vanilla macro stress tests the bank has been engaged with since the global financial crisis. First, it will include multiple scenarios to capture both transition and physical risks. The broad profiles of these scenarios are set out on this next slide. Let me start with the purple lines, which describe a no additional policy actions scenario. And here, as the name suggests, no policy actions beyond those which have already been announced are delivered. So the transition here is insufficient for the world to meet Paris goals. This is a case where physical risks would be maximized. Then we have the benign early policy action scenario, which is set out in blue lines on this chart. This is where we see immediate concerted effort from governments worldwide to implement Paris-consistent climate policies, resulting in as close as we can get to a smooth transition. Of course, the far more likely scenario is the late policy action case shown in the orange lines on the slide. Here, the idea is that governments delay action for several further years, but then embark on a cold turkey approach to decarbonisation when the urgency of the situation cannot be delayed further. I think this is the most interesting of the scenarios considered. It delivers maximum transition risk as countries slam on the brakes, and we'd expect to see large falls in asset valuations, accompanied by an economic contraction as societies grapple with structural change. Some other features of the proposed scenario that I think are worth highlighting. Firstly, it will be a joint test of both bank and insurer balance sheets. It's something the Bank of England hasn't done previously, and other central banks haven't either. And it will allow the bank to look at possible interactions between these two sectors in potentially amplifying the risks. The horizon being modelled will also run out 30 years, so a much longer horizon than is common in stress testing. The bank will seek to provide integrated climate and macro financial variables, something, again, that will be a big challenge for the bank, but it's a key contribution of the exercise. And the bank's expectation is that participating firms will run counterparty level analysis. That means banks assessing the viability of the business models of the individual companies they lend to. And the expectation is that will occur for the vast majority of the balance sheets. And needless to say, this is an extremely tricky exercise to pull off well. And I think the first attempts will really be best viewed as like the first on a sequence of many in this area. It's tricky for the following reasons. So central banks have almost no experience in building scenarios with climate macro links. As I said, part of the aim here is developing their capacity to do so in future. There are also technical questions about how to run an exercise with a 30-year horizon. Given that most firms will have no experience projecting their balance sheets this far out, At the same time, even a 30-year horizon won't be sufficient to capture some of the physical risks that we expect to transpire later this century. There are subtle questions around how much information to provide to firms via the scenarios. More information means more consistent results. The risk of kind of crowding out information about what firms expect themselves to happen. And more fundamentally, I think there are questions about how far out in the tail to position these scenarios. Should they be severe but plausible, i.e. kind of really tail outcomes, or should they be closer to a prudent best guess? Maybe these are thoughts we can come back to in the discussion. Let me end by saying a few words about central banks' wider role in the transition. And the first point I'd like to make here is that while these stress tests will be extremely useful, they shouldn't be viewed as a surrogate for higher carbon taxes. By themselves, they won't correct the risk pricing anomaly I described at the beginning. The first generation of these tests have explicitly ruled out a link to regulatory capital. And institution-specific results won't be published. So these won't result in a direct financial impact for firms. Central banks do, however, have other possible tools at their disposal. We're seeing efforts underway to improve climate-related disclosures. I'd view this as a necessary condition to address the risk pricing issue. Central banks could also adjust their bank capital frameworks by raising the risk weights on brown assets. That's something that's been discussed a lot. And they could exclude fossil fuel assets from future bond purchases or from their collateral frameworks on the monetary policy side. So these tools are available. And I think there are two questions we could perhaps return to in the discussion here. So first, to what extent are such measures within the remits of central banks? And secondly, how effective would we think they'd be? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that interesting introduction. So you should just be on camera again now and unmute your microphone so that we can have a tiny chat with you. There you are. Nice to see you again. You ended your presentation by asking a question. How effective will it be? So what is your view on that? How effective can it be? Oh, we don't have any sound, David. So hang on a second. We'll see if you are maybe. Oh, there you are. So yeah, you can start all over again, please.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I left the presentation with two questions. One about, are these issues within the remits of central banks? I mean, my answer to that question would be yes, if you kind of interpret the mandates of central banks sufficiently broadly. So most central banks have like a primary mandate to do with price stability or financial stability. And there's usually then a secondary mandate that says you should support the economic policies of the government. I think, obviously supporting a sustainable growth trajectory for the economy is within that, I would argue. On the question of effectiveness, I must admit, I'm a little bit skeptical that the measures that I outline on my slide would do a great deal, if I'm being frank. So the two specific measures I mentioned were we could increase risk weights for banks. Basically, this is the amount of capital they need to hold when they're financing different assets. If a country unilaterally tried to increase risk weights, these markets are very, very international, and what would happen is large companies would just be able to borrow from other jurisdictions. So it would require a multilateral approach. This is why the work of the Basel Committee is quite important here. More generally, though, these companies have a load of different sources of finance they can access. Increased risk weights affect bank finance. They can also issue bonds in capital markets, and those other types of finance wouldn't be subject to the requirements. So this is an area that's a little bit tricky.
It is, but is this happening to a certain extent now that central banks are actually using their financial muscle in order to move a transition in either one or another direction. Do you see any signs of that now?
And for me, it's more a signal about the direction that society wants to go. So I think if central banks come out and say, first of all, we want the financial system to stress test against these risks, that's a big signal to financial institutions to take this seriously. It's also kind of, you could view it as supporting wider government efforts to support a transition. My honest view is to actually make this happen, it will require some government action to tilt incentives in the financial sector much more towards green assets. And that does mean kind of either, it effectively means higher carbon prices, I think. And so I view then central banks' efforts as kind of supporting that rather than the driving force.
Now, David, I'm going to stop you for a second there, because today we have, as I mentioned earlier, a small panel of experts who are going to help me out asking questions to the presenters. Often these do have slightly different perspectives in their questions. And today's experts, they are two in the number. They are both from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, the NTNU. The first one is Asgeir Thomas Gahr, the director of the Energy Transition Initiative at the university, and he's also our host here today. And he's also a professor in economics and optimization, doing research on energy transition, strategies and energy policy. I'm going to mention the second expert, though we're not going to meet him quite yet. That's Thomas Moskjølsvold, and he too is a professor at the NTNU, and he's conducting research in the interface between technology and social science, having, amongst others, studied Norwegian transitional strategies towards a green energy system. So today I'm going to let one expert ask one presenter a question, well, each presenter one question or two, so that we have some time for the larger discussion later on. And I think, Asgeir, I can see that you're already on camera. Do you have a question ready for David?
So thank you, and thank you first for a very interesting presentation. I think it's highly interesting to see and learn about how financial institutions are preparing to understand better the risks that we are exposed to in a changing environment. And as I understand you, there has been a very high focus on stress testing how well portfolios can cope with the climate effects of climate change and also the physical effects of climate change. And I think, as you say, that will already drive investments somehow in the right direction if transition is the purpose. But if you look at this, you also mentioned that this will also obviously change business models of companies, and it will change maybe as a consequence of climate change, but also as a consequence of consumers' preferences linked to climate change, and also to the technology switches that we will have as a consequence of the energy transition, for example, fuel switching and phasing out some technologies. So I'm wondering, this must also be very much related to what I would call market risk, where at one point the market prices highly in terms of risk rates some of the investments that earlier have been quite profitable. And at one point, well, I guess that it's easy to see that, for example, Norway as a petroleum heavy country, if you look traditionally, countries have tended to overinvest in technologies that has been very successful, and then you have disruptive changes. So in which way does large financial institutions handle this market risk of being overinvested and locked into technologies on the way out?
That's a really prescient question, I think. Economists tend to use the word, or this word, Minsky moments has kind of entered the lexicon of economists to describe what you're talking about. So this idea that, at one moment people view the future as rosy and asset valuations are consistent with that, and then there's suddenly an abrupt change in expectations in a way that's very hard to predict ex ante, but we do know that these things can happen. And what looked like a valuable asset at one stage can suddenly change dramatically. So I would say kind of testing for market risk is like one of the fundamental things that central banks do with their capital framework. So that's not like a new risk in any way. What is new is the kind of climate dimension to that, and understanding which assets will reprice most heavily. You know, we obviously have we can have a good guess of the assets that will be most directly at risk. You know, anything that has a kind of a high carbon element to it. I think what's harder is trying to understand the second round effect. So exactly as you said, you know, this process will trigger large changes in our societies, and that's you know, that will have second round effects that can be very hard to actually gauge ex ante. So this is where the kind of art in stress testing lies. I think there's no kind of, you can't rely on history to kind of understand how, you know, the scale of these risks. It has to be more forward-looking judgments about you know, which sectors may be most at risk. There is an approach that I like, sometimes goes under the name of reverse stress testing, where you ask a financial firm, what is it that would cause the most trouble for you? So rather than trying to second guess what will happen, what will go wrong, you kind of put the question to them. And I think that can be a useful approach in dealing with what you say.
Thank you, both of you, for this, the question and your good answer, David. We have to move forward, but there are two questions in Slido, and I would like to ask one of them now and maybe save the second one for later. And you have to answer really shortly because we have to move on. How is the alternative of reduced growth, economic and/or population, so demographically, included in future economic models?
Ooh.
Is it included at all?
It's not. It's the short one.
Maybe it should be.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think kind of you know, that idea that we do need to kind of stop growth, for me, is viewed on a slightly old-fashioned way of understanding the growth process in our economy. You know, growth will be more about the services sector, intangibles. It doesn't require natural resource use, I would argue. There's a short answer for you.
So growth is always going to be on the table. Great. Well, thank you so much this far, David. We're going to meet you again later on. So for the large discussion and the panel that we're going to have. And thanks also to Oscar. So now we're saying goodbye to David for the moment.